Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today's panel is the fifth in a series of 7 events organized at AUB entitled For Palestine, Analyzing Settler Colonialism and the Return of Fascism. We're very glad that today's event is organized in collaboration with the Center for Middle East Studies at Harvard University and co-organized among 3 programs at AUB: the Critical Humanities for the Liberal Arts Program, the Center for Arts and Humanity, and the Critical Approaches for Development to Development Studies Program. Our speakers today are Dr. Amahl Bishara and Tareq Baconi, both of whom I think you know. Tareq Baconi is the author of Hamas Contained, The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance, and he's the board president of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Dr. Amahl Bishara is Associate Professor of Anthropology at Tufts University and is the author of 2 books, Crossing a Line, Laws, Violence, and Roadblocks to Palestinian Political Expression, that just came out in 2022, and Backstories, U.S. News Production and Palestinian Politics in 2013. So we will start with Tareq Baconi. Our speakers will each present for around 20 to 25 minutes, and then we will open this up for discussion. Everyone is muted at the moment, so if you need to talk, you will need to raise your hand to be unmuted. And we're recording, so if you don't want to be recorded, you will need to drop a note in the chat box. Tareq, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rima. Thank you for having me today, and thank you to everyone for joining. I want to talk about 2 things in the 20 minutes that I have, and I probably won't take the full 20 minutes. I'm interested in the Q&A and the discussion afterwards. But the first point that I want to talk about is to contextualize the Gaza Strip, specifically Gaza, in the context of settler colonialism and how we need to understand it in the geographic reality of Palestine. And then the second, I want to talk specifically about Hamas and what Hamas is in this context and its role as a governing authority in the Gaza Strip. So to start with the first point around Gaza, the main point that I want to make is really around understanding the Gaza Strip not as a state of exception, but actually the culmination of what Zionist settler colonialism wants to do and has done in the land of historic Palestine. The idea that we have a small strip of land that is densely populated by Palestinians, the majority of whom are refugees claiming a right of return to homes that are now in Israel, is structurally very similar to what other urban centers and Palestinian population centers look like throughout the land of historic Palestine, including in Israel itself. But that is taken to an extreme. That similarity is taken to an extreme in the case of the Gaza Strip. So the de-exceptionalization is to say that there are structural realities that we see in the Gaza Strip now that can also be discerned in cities like Nazareth, and that can also be discerned in East Jerusalem and in cities throughout the West Bank, where we have Palestinians confined to spaces that they cannot grow out of and that are surrounded by Jewish settlements and by Israeli control of land and Israeli citizenry. Now, the Gaza Strip itself is a colonial structure in the sense that Gaza really existed before 48, existed as a city that was similar to other cities throughout the region, Beirut, Haifa, Damascus, and others. The creation of a strip is really the result of the the 1948 Nakba for Palestinians and the creation of the State of Israel, and the formulation of a strip of land that then fell under Egyptian control after 1948 until 1967. So the contours of what we imagine the Gaza Strip to be now, which includes 5 governorates, is actually a product of Zionist settler colonialism. It's not the indigenous reality of how Gaza existed as a geographic space in the land of historic Palestine before. Now, it's really important to contextualize Gaza within the one-state reality that we often talk about within this structure of apartheid that exists in historic Palestine. Often the case when people and certainly policymakers or politicians talk about the Gaza Strip, it's severed from the rest of Palestine. It's seen as something that exists on the corner of the land of historic Palestine, and the main confrontation is one between Israel as a state and the West Bank. The Gaza Strip is somehow seen as separate. But if we accept the fact that Zionist settler colonialism is focused on maximizing territorial control and minimizing the presence of Palestinians, then, as I said, the placement of Palestinians in constricted geographies that are then surrounded by Israeli rule becomes a model that they use. That model is a form of demographic engineering. And Gaza is the extreme manifestation of that, but it's actually not exceptional to Israel. If we look at other settler colonies, including in the US or in South Africa, the idea of building those kinds of Bantustans is a way these settler colonial regimes deal with the demographic threat. So they create realities, they dispossess and ethnically cleanse people and create new realities where structurally it looks like those regimes have the demographics that they need, but that's really because the populations under their control are managed in restricted areas. And this is very stark and increasingly stark in the case of Israel, which fashions itself as a Jewish state, where when in reality it's a state that is acting as a sovereign to more Palestinians than Jews in the land of historic Palestine. But that engineering is then enabled by severing the Gaza Strip off from the rest of historic Palestine and siphoning it off behind a blockade. So that's sort of the first point that I want to make around the Gaza Strip, the structure, de-exceptionalizing it and bringing it back into a reality of what Palestinians are facing across the land of historic Palestine. The second point that I want to make is specifically to talk about Hamas within this context. Now, there's a misconception that's often used, which is to say that the blockade on the Gaza Strip is understood as a response to Hamas, that this is a security threat, that Hamas presents a security threat to the state of Israel, and therefore the only way to deal with the Gaza Strip is to place it under blockade because Hamas exists there. That's ahistorical because the reality is that that the Gaza Strip has presented a challenge to Zionist settler colonialism and to Israel since 1948. There's been every effort to try to pacify the Gaza Strip using bombardment, using the development of collaborator networks, using targeted assassinations, using economic strangulation, using war. There's been more than 12 wars on the Gaza Strip before the 2023 attack that we're seeing now. All of these efforts are to try to pacify the Gaza Strip and to depoliticize Palestinians there and fundamentally to upend their demand for the right of return. Now, with Hamas's rise, and obviously, it's important to note that this rise was democratic, that it rose to power democratically in 2006 and was met with a regime change operation and a coup effort that's led by and facilitated by the US, which ultimately ended up containing Hamas in the Gaza Strip. Hamas became the perfect pretext for Israel to justify efforts to separate the Gaza Strip. So suddenly this became about security. And this became about dealing with an organization that was quote unquote a radical terrorist organization. So using the narrative of terrorism, and obviously there's a level of Islamophobia here. The fact that Hamas is an Islamist movement is what justifies this narrative and justifies this language. But then Hamas becomes the perfect fig leaf. It is the reason why the Gaza Strip is blockaded. It is the reason why the Gaza Strip is then severed from the rest of Palestine. Now, this ends up doing several things. It depoliticizes the reality in the Gaza Strip. It decontextualizes Hamas. It becomes a linear, a sort of a one-dimensional terrorist movement that needs to be eradicated, and it justifies collective punishment against Palestinians. And it then ends up creating a dynamic which we're seeing today in horrifying ways, which is the conflation of civilians with this political party, and the idea that if anyone elected Hamas, and it's Palestinians in Gaza who have elected Hamas, therefore they deserve to die. Therefore, they deserve to be punished in the way that they're being punished today. And this really, this is sort of narrative that's being pushed forward by Israel and that is supported by specifically the US and the Biden administration, is one that ends up creating the possibility of eradication, that we're no longer talking about a people, we're no longer talking about civilians, we're actually talking about pure evil. And that then becomes a recipe for the kind of genocidal violence that we're seeing today. But Hamas in that context becomes, or in that political formulation, becomes inextricably linked with Gaza. And so what Israel is doing is ridding itself, it's attempting to suggest that it is trying to defeat Hamas militarily, but it very quickly becomes apparent that what it's trying to do is actually to eradicate the Gaza Strip and the Palestinians within it. And that the way that those two goals become interlinked has a longer history, which goes back to the first point I was making, the idea that the Palestinians themselves are the problem. They need to be placed in Bantustans. They need to be demographically engineered in the way that they are. Now, Hamas, and this is the final point that I want to make here, Hamas then becomes in some ways the container for the Israeli effort to try to depoliticize the Palestinians. So what do I mean by that? There's every effort to suggest that Hamas is an irrational actor that's focused on the destruction of the state of Israel, that there can be no political engagement with Hamas, that its political demands are beyond the pale. Meanwhile, Hamas as an actor is actually articulating political demands that have a long trajectory in the Palestinian political movement that far predate Hamas. When Hamas is talking about the right of return, when it's talking about the liberation of the land of historic Palestine, when it's talking about the right to use armed resistance against a foreign occupier, these were demands that were articulated by the secular nationalist movements before Hamas. Hamas articulates those demands in an Islamist garb. And that becomes the foundation through which it's putting forward its political project. Now, in its current iteration, it's being marginalized for all the reasons that I just said, including Islamophobia. But those political demands themselves were marginalized in the past when they were articulated by other factors, by other factions. The PLO itself was seen as a terrorist organization that was beyond the pale, that couldn't be engaged with before Hamas's creation. And the PLO dealt with that challenge by offering the historic concession of recognizing the state of Israel. And in response, it's been marginalized and it hasn't been able to put forward any effective following its historic concession, it hasn't been able to gain any effective victory for the Palestinian people. Hamas has existed now as a party that understands that historical context, that understands the difficulty of putting forward diplomatic concessions to a regime that is unwilling or unable to deal with the core political demands of the Palestinian people. Now, that has meant that Hamas ends up for the Israelis as a party that must be restricted to the Gaza Strip, and now since October 7th, eradicated from the Gaza Strip in its entirety. And so the point being that the attack that we're seeing now is one that is not focused on Hamas, but rather on the political drivers that animate Hamas and that animate actually Palestinian nationalism beyond Hamas. But I think I'll stop there and take on any questions as needed.
Great. Thank you so much, Tareq. I'm sure we'll come back with many questions. I'll give the floor now to Amahl.
Thank you so much, Rima. Thank you, Tareq. It's really great to be in conversation with you all. I'm learning so much from all of this amazing community in these terrifying weeks and months. Just remark that while there's many reasons to wear a kufiya on any day, I'm wearing a kufiya today in honor of 3 Palestinian students. I'm in Massachusetts, in my neighboring state of Vermont, who were shot and injured on Saturday. Hisham Awartani, Kenan Abdul Hamid, and Tahsin Ahmed, and wishing them well and a smooth recovery. And they were shot while speaking Arabic and wearing a kufiya and walking on the street. And I've been thinking this week, as I've been wearing a kufiya in my teaching and in academic settings, of how this kind of at once signifies strength and vulnerability today, how also I think in academic settings we're very accustomed to speaking as individuals with kind of a close attachment to our own name with the words that we say, and what perhaps wearing a kufiya does to sort of transform our presence and link us up to Palestinian collectivities. So I thought I would just make that quick note. So I wanted to think about a kind of a Palestinian framework for understanding these events of the last several weeks, how we take in the vast and unprecedented scope of Israeli violence, but also put it into historical context, which obviously Tareq has done for us already so brilliantly and in other settings so brilliantly as well. Genocide is an important legal frame, especially as we listen to the words of Israeli leaders who are expressing eliminatory intent, and as we struggle to take in the unprecedented scope of Israeli violence. But I also want to go back to another key term for us in Palestinian political thought, the term of Nakba. Of course, sort of this evolving sense of what Nakba is and means for us I think one older dominant sense of what Nakba meant was as an event linked to, Palestinian dispossession in 1948. But Palestinians for many years now have been thinking about a Nakba Mustamirra, the ongoing Nakba. And, of course, that resonates with the thinking of Patrick Wolf and others in the field of settler colonialism studies who think about, of course, settler colonialism as not an event, but a structure. So the ongoing Nakba helps us to think about the ongoing quality of dispossession and elimination across many modes of violence that Palestinians have been experiencing. But I also think that this sense of a continuity of violence is unfortunately challenged by the horrific scale of the violence of the last weeks. So perhaps we can think about this as a terrifying new chapter in Nakba, where we've seen 1.7 million people displaced from their homes, more than the 750,000 to 1 million who became refugees in 1948. The other reason why I think it's important to think about Nakba, though, is that it's a term that helps us to bring in all Palestinians everywhere. Because when we think about the ongoing Nakba, it's been a way to think about how Palestinians in different places have been experiencing ongoing forms of dispossession and violence, even though those forms of violence are not the same. And I think that that's something that's very important to underscore today. So I want to kind of go back to this theme of how Israeli settler colonialism has operated through fragmentation, but how its forms of violence have been interlinked. And I think Tareq's remarks about how Gaza is not a state of exception, but a culmination of what Israel is doing to Palestinian populations in urban spaces, in crowded places, in so many places is something that I'm sort of building on in this way. So this theme of fragmentation as a means of dispossession is something that's been recognized in a lot of ways. One key text for me has been the 2017 text by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley, their report on Israeli practices towards the Palestinian people and the question of apartheid, which I was surprised to open up and read. It began more or less quite near the top, saying the strategic fragmentation of the Palestinian people is the principal method by which Israel imposes an apartheid regime. The fact of fragmentation as key to the way that Israel operates is something that, you know, is complex to take in, but is what actually has been preventing Palestinians in some ways from, or it's been an obstacle to Palestinians struggling together towards liberation that will serve all Palestinians. And that apartheid framework, as we know, has taken center stage over the last several years across a number of human rights reports, building on decades of Palestinian work in that realm. But I'm thinking, of course, of more recent work from B'Tselem, from Human Rights Watch, from Amnesty International, and also from the Independent International Commission of Inquiry, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry, all of which think with apartheid, and all of which think of Palestinians inside Israel, but also in the occupied territories. But even more than those reports, we can think of the 2021 Palestinian uprising and the Dignity and Hope Manifesto, which echoed similar themes about fragmentation and reassertion of unity. That Dignity and Hope Manifesto read in part, "The story of truth is a simple one in our land. The truth is that Palestinians are one people, one society. They tried to turn us into different societies, each living apart, each in its own separate prison. This is how Israel imprisoned us in prisons of isolation. Some of us caged in the Oslo prison in the West Bank, some in the citizenship prison in the part of Palestine occupied in 1948, some of us isolated by the monstrous siege and ongoing devastating assault on the Gaza prison, some of us isolated under the systematic Judaization campaigns on the Jerusalem prison, and some isolated from Palestine altogether, dispersed all across all corners of the globe." So two reasons why I'm reading that now is, one, because of this message of fragmentation as something that's being used against us, and as a powerful reassertion of unity, but also because this thinking is being developed, through these moments and periods of activism and popular uprising that bring people into the street, again, across so many cities and towns and villages and refugee camps. So I think it's really important to underscore that thought that happens through the process of mobilization, and to, make sure that we listen as much as we can to those moments. So I'm going to move forward here. Thinking about fragmentation has been central to my work as an ethnographer, where I've been able to do ethnography in the West Bank and in Israel's 1948 territories to think about what prevents Palestinians from speaking together and speaking with each other, speaking as a collective and speaking to each other and acting together. And I have, as an ethnographer, being sort of in place and in connection with communities in the Galilee, to a certain extent, in other parts of Israel's 1948 territory, and especially at a refugee camp in Bethlehem in the West Bank, has been important practice for me. As I was doing that work, it was always really important to think about Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinians elsewhere in diaspora, refugees, but to build through the ethnography as well. One thing that I've been saying kind of for years, and I'm repeating this paragraph because I think it's important to kind of think about how, the repeating of this paragraph sort of symbols the way, or for me signifies the way that Israeli violence is repetitive and systematic, but also eruptive in ways that Palestinians, again, know all too well. So I've been thinking for a long time about how Palestinians are always looking over their shoulders at other kinds of violence, knowing that those forms of violence could happen to them. 48 Palestinians see protesters being shot and killed regularly in the West Bank, and they know that while this is perhaps more rare in the Naqab, in Al-Hiran, or in the Galilee than it is in the West Bank, it could happen to them. Palestinians in the West Bank watch the bombs fall on Gaza in attack after horrible attack, and many will remember the F-16s flying over their cities, shooting missiles during the Second Intifada. They know this violence could return to them. And perhaps all are thinking about the mass dispossession of Palestinians in 1948, looking at refugees outside of Palestine and knowing that this kind of dispossession is not unthinkable either. So if that's something that again, I've been thinking about for years, this is a moment when those blurring of forms of violence are happening right now, with Israeli air power being used against people in Jenin refugee camp, with administrative detention being used against Palestinian citizens of Israel, with these forms of arrest for political expression, again, happening across the Green Line, and of course, internal displacement of Palestinians in Gaza, and also Palestinians in the West Bank happening in the terrifying shadow of mass displacement outside of Palestine. I also wanted to sort of highlight how also, as we've been fragmented into these different spaces, Palestinians have also been resisting in ways that are similar but different. It's understandable, and of course, it's important that those forms of resistance be different across the political spaces in which we find ourselves, because we need to be responding to local contexts as well as to broader movements. But I think it's also very important to underscore the ways in which our forms of resistance have been linking up and have been, ongoing, and also how Israel has aimed to criminalize Palestinian resistance, more or less whatever forms it's taken. So when Palestinians work through political structures, whether in Israel or in the occupied territories, we've seen obviously a criminalization of Palestinian political participation. And of course, Tareq has already emphasized how Hamas has been created as this ultimate enemy that justifies any level of violence. But and I think we can think also of how sort of that is built around to criminalize political participation for Palestinian citizens of Israel, for 48 Palestinians, as well as in the West Bank. And we see how leaders in 48 across the Palestinian political spectrum have faced criminalization. How we see of course, the arrest of Palestinian parliament members in the West Bank as well. So to the extent that those political formations obviously are so flawed, and yet even when people try to work through them, they they find that to be impossible. We find the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, criminalized within Israel, and also movements around the globe to stigmatize participation in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement through like a variety of forms of local laws, like in the United States, ways of stigmatizing participation in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement through accusations of anti-Semitism and so forth. Of course, we see mass arrests and also, outright military violence when we see popular uprisings. But I know that Palestinians in 48 inside Israel and in the West Bank are still managing the aftermath of arrests from the Dignity Intifada of 2021. Nevertheless, we see these kinds of protests happen, and so for me, I was in Palestine in 2014 during what was up to then the largest, or up to this year, the largest Israeli war on Gaza. And it was incredible to see Palestinians in Haifa, in Al-Lid, in Bethlehem, in my small village of Tarshiha in the Galilee, all standing in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza to end this horrific war. So I think that's an important kind of form of protest that has happened across many different spaces. And I think it's also especially terrifying and alarming to see that those forms of protest are not happening this year because of the reduction in civil and political liberties that have happened inside Israel and in the Palestinian Authority West Bank since 2014. So that's something big for us to think about and take in. Across all of these spaces, we also see Palestinians working hard to honor prisoners, and also sometimes making sure that they're not even using a lot language of solidarity, but saying we are one people, and the language of solidarity doesn't even capture the sort of the level of cohesion and unity that we feel and experience. And then I've thought also about Nakba commemorations, which we see, of course, in Lebanon, we see, throughout Palestinian refugee communities, but also marches of return for 48 Palestinians, and so many different ways of commemorating the Nakba every year in the occupied territories. And we see, and also for Palestinians in diaspora beyond, like in places like where I am in Boston. We see similar ways of doing this work, of using Palestinian village names, but also of telling stories of the ongoing Nakba and ongoing displacement that are happening, in the sites of those gatherings. Palestinians can't gather all together in one place, even within, historic Palestine, even within the West Bank. Usually they can't even gather in one place. And yet it's important that these gatherings happen in small places throughout the West Bank, because it's a way, again, to learn those local histories of ongoing dispossession, and to gather together to kind of exercise this muscle of collectivity, and to create these spaces of learning and being together. They inspire each other, and they give Palestinians the capacity to keep organizing, even though, again, a Nakba commemoration has also been criminalized inside Israel. The Palestinian Authority sometimes represses and limits the forms of Nakba commemoration that can happen, and protests on Nakba Day. And obviously, the Israeli occupation forces also attack people participating in those commemorations. One thing I've been thinking about a lot this year with grief and humility is the Gaza Great March of Return of 2018, on the 70th, the 70th anniversary of the Nakba, which started on Land Day on Friday, March 30th, as at least 30,000 Palestinians in Gaza stood up to decades of dispossession and fragmentation, to more than 50 years of military occupation, and to what was then 11 or 12 years of all-out siege, although, yeah, absolutely, closure has been going on so much longer, gathering for the right of return, for the end of the siege, for their right to movement. And it's important to recognize that these are issues that are integrally connected for Palestinians in Gaza, given that two-thirds of them, more than two-thirds, more like 4/5 are refugees. So thinking about the connection between the right of return and the need for the end of blockade. That year, one of the march's co-founders, Ahmed Abu Artema, wrote a message that he sent to US-based Palestinian activists, which I'll read a little bit to you. He wrote, but this is an English translation that was done over here on this side of the Atlantic. The right of return is the heart of the struggle for Palestinians. The first generation of refugees has been passing down the right of return and the love of villages and towns that they were forced to leave 70 years ago to their children and grandchildren. This is one of the main reasons behind the massive response to the March of Return, which brought together all political and social groups. The March of Return represents the birth of a new life in the face of many attempts to kill the Palestinians and their cause. The March of Return is a proof of the will of the people and their determination and belief in their rights. It proves that people are stronger than the arsenal of weapons owned by the occupiers. I've been thinking so much about this March of Return in the last few weeks, both because it's a model of protest, because it builds on histories, on traditions of struggle, and also because of Ahmed Abu Artema's profound personal losses in the last weeks of family members, of his own son, Aboud, who is 12 years old. So honoring him, as well as so many other people who've been struggling for so many years in such difficult circumstances for liberation. I'm going to move ahead a little bit just to talk a little bit about, I think I have like maybe 5 minutes, and I admire just 5 minutes to talk a little bit about what's happening now, in particular for 48 Palestinians and Palestinians in the West Bank. Of course, many 48 Palestinians are facing new threats of street violence and other forms of violence against them in cities like Haifa and Yafa and Lid, and Ramla as they watch as civil militias are being formed around them with the encouragement of Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Kahanist Jewish supremacist Minister of National Security. Since October 7th, over 120,000 Israelis have applied for a gun license. And as people remember the civilian violence against Palestinians in 2021, these civil militias infuse terror into spaces where Palestinians live in proximity with Jewish Israelis. We know that the atmosphere regarding free expression is alarming, even more than it has been in past years. People being arrested for social media posts, including things like verses in the Quran. One woman was arrested for posting, God is not unaware of what the oppressors do. So oftentimes a rhetoric of incitement is used, or accusations of incitement are used to make these arrests, but we can see how the language of incitement is so consistently twisted against Palestinians. There's a new social media law passed on November 8th, 2023, that criminalizes not just expression, but even consumption of certain forms of media. It criminalizes the system, quote, the systematic and continuous consumption of publications of a terrorist organization under circumstances that indicate identification with this terrorist organization, end quote, targeting and thus tacitly equating Hamas and ISIS. We see, of course, a wave of firings, expulsions, and arrests of Palestinians, citizens of Israel, which will have long, long effects. In the West Bank, we know that these have been weeks of alarm, fear, and death, with over 200 Palestinians killed in the occupied West Bank since October 7th, through ground raids, people killed as fighters as they opened fire at checkpoints, and through attacks on refugee camps, in particular in Tulkarm and in Jenin. We also see that 16 entire Palestinian communities in the West Bank have been dispossessed of their lands. Bedouin communities in the West Bank who've been forced to leave their homes due to settler and military violence. And finally, we see this massive wave of arrests. Prison chases people's lives and safety all the time. And Israel's policies of administrative detention and the PA's policies of security cooperation with the occupation mean that people can be arrested and held without charge at any time, right? With being held for 6 months in terms that can be renewed. And even before October 7th, administrative detention was at a 20-year high, with over the summer, about 1 in 4 Palestinian political prisoners being held under administrative detention, again, held without charges. But we know now that, according to Adamir, since October 7th, over 3,000 Palestinians, including 120 women and over 200 children, have been arrested. And these arrests, of course, also create violence within communities, as people are being arrested in night raids that terrify families and neighborhoods and also bring death. In the community that I know best, which is a small community of around 5,000 people, more than 30 people have been arrested in just 6 weeks. And in one of those night arrest raids, 17-year-old Muhammad Al-Aziyah was killed as he was on a rooftop up early in the morning studying for his high school exams with his sister. So in conclusion, these are times of unparalleled grief and outrage. We watch as our elders and children and are being killed. We know that they're dying in the rubble. We see the fabric of society rent as teachers lose their students and students lose their teachers. We watch old and young grieve for each other. Our largest Palestinian city, Gaza, and one of our largest refugee camps, Jabalia, destroyed beyond recognition. We also see some of our smallest places erased, as in those Bedouin communities in the West Bank. We need to find ways to hold all of them dear. I think it's difficult to take in how all of this will shift Palestinian futures, and the impact all of this will have on the possibilities for conversations about and actions toward Palestinian liberation. We know that those conversations were already very, very fragile. But I hope we can find ways to renew those conversations and build towards those visions of liberation nevertheless. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amahl and Tareq, for 2 great presentations and for centering Palestinian liberation in both your talks. I'm sure there's a lot to discuss, so we will open the floor up. Anyone who has a question or comment can raise their hand and we will unmute them. I mean, to get the conversation going, there is a question in the chat. So Muhammad Nahas is saying, thank you for your intervention. My question follows the line of thought presented in Tareq's work, Hamas Contained. Are the indications that similar policies are being planned to contain the current moment, especially that many Arab regimes have interest in the Israeli regime? So I'll collect 3 questions. I have some questions too, but I'll leave them for later. I see Rami Khouri's hand is up. So Rami, you can unmute.
Yes, thank you very much, Rima and both speakers. I'd like to ask Tareq, but also Amahl, whoever wants to answer. But the question is, as we see events in Gaza today looking a lot like another Nakba of a slightly different nature possibly, but essentially driving out the population. They haven't been driven out of Palestine yet, but they might, and certainly the Israelis, some of them, many want to do that. How do you sense the lessons of the original Nakba when we were quite helpless to do anything? Are we as helpless today, or do you see mechanisms by which ordinary people in Palestine and abroad can contribute to the political resistance that that is required to prevent another Nakba or minimize it?
Thank you, Rami. If there are any other questions, you can raise your hand. So yeah, Tareq, I had a question also linked to the question that Muhammad has asked. In your book, you make the argument that Israel has reached a stage where it was very convinced that it had contained Hamas, to the point that it actually preferred to keep Hamas rather than change the governance of Gaza. Of course, I mean, the events of October 7 have changed this equation. So I'm wondering, how are you thinking about this? I mean, obviously Hamas is uncontained at the moment, and also how do we think about Hamas abroad, beyond the borders of Gaza? And namely, I mean, there's a history of Hamas's role in Syria and then moving to Qatar, but also where the leadership is now, but also in Lebanon and other places. So that's my question for Tareq. And Amahl, I had a question that might take the discussion to maybe a bit of a different angle, but I'm wondering about how would you think about the mobilizations in Palestine in the past decade, but more specifically in the past few years. I mean, from the Great March of Return to the Dignity Intifada, the Habbe movements like Tal'at, the feminist movement. How would we think about this in the context of the Arab uprisings? And would you see any links? Also, to open doors to think about the Arab solidarity with Palestine, and I would think the shift in this relationship with the region that is often talked about at the geopolitical level of regimes normalizing, etc. But there's a more popular link between these populations and their struggles. So I'll stop here. Oh, I see one more question in the chat. So I'll read that and then we'll turn back to you. Scott Long is asking, settler colonialism broadly and apartheid specifically are obviously crucial frames here, but I'd like to ask what you see as most relevant in the experience of other liberation movements in settler colonial societies in South Africa and elsewhere that hold instructive examples for the Palestinian cause. Okay, so these are many questions. Let's start with Tareq and then Amahl.
Thank you, Rima, and thank you for the questions. So I'll try to answer them in sequence, and some of them are actually interlinked. So I'll just flow through the answers. I mean, the first thing really is to talk about the containment of Hamas's containment in the Gaza Strip, and then what happened on October 7th. So over the course of the past 17 years, since 2007, Hamas has been effectively contained in the Gaza Strip. And what that meant, and what I had written about in my book, which you referenced, Rima, is that there was an equilibrium emerge between Hamas and Israel. And I call it a belligerent equilibrium, or an equilibrium of violence. Within the context of that equilibrium, Hamas was, as far as the Israelis were concerned, enabled as the governing authority in the Gaza Strip. It's very telling when we hear today Israelis talk about Hamas as pure evil or the need to eradicate Hamas, when for the past 17 years they've enabled and facilitated its governance in the Gaza Strip, because that, as I had said in my intervention, gave them the fig leaf to separate Gaza from the rest of Palestine. But as far as the Israelis were concerned, Hamas was a very reliable interlocutor, because it was able to manage the resistance from the Gaza Strip in a way that was actually very similar to how an equilibrium emerged between Hezbollah and Israel. So it was, in a way, Hamas was seen as a party that Israel could engage with indirectly. And as far as the Israelis were concerned, they were looking for what they call calm in the area surrounding the Gaza Strip. Now, Hamas, for its part, accepted its role as a governance authority, because that gave it a base within the Gaza Strip from which to develop its resistance and its political infrastructure. But it was also ambivalent about its governing responsibilities. It wanted primarily to be a movement that was committed to military resistance and to disrupting the occupation. But it was shackled by the containment and by the fact that it was now, after its election victory in 2006, responsible for Palestinians in Gaza. But while accepting that governance position and focusing on building a resistance base, it occasionally disrupted the blockade using rocket fire. So every time the blockade became too restrictive, the conditions within the Gaza Strip would become too difficult for Palestinians, Hamas would try to challenge the Israeli blockade and force restrictions. Every time Hamas would fire rockets that would initiate indirect ceasefire negotiations between the two parties, Israel would loosen the blockade a bit, aid would come in, Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza would be placated for a while until the next escalation. From the Israeli military perspective, the doctrine was known as mowing the lawn. Every few years, they would go in and remove Hamas's military capabilities. Now, that violent equilibrium worked in some ways incredibly successfully for Israelis, in the sense that they imagined that they could actually have indefinite calm. Obviously, in their thinking, the violence of the blockade, the collective punishment of the blockade, is besides the point. They expect the Palestinians to be able to maintain calm even though they are living under horrific conditions. But from their perspective, the model was so successful that Gaza and Hamas more broadly was out of mind, out of sight. The fact that the Israeli military establishment was not prepared for or had conceived of the possibility of what happened on October 7th shows how much they believe Hamas had actually been pacified, and how much Hamas specifically, but Palestinians more broadly, and how much they believed in the success of their containment. Now, the containment was effective while it lasted, but as I had argued in the book, and as many others have argued, Hamas never conceded ideologically. Hamas offered pragmatic political concessions that were never used or taken up or leveraged by Israel or international actors. But ideologically, it always remained consistent that it believed in the right of armed resistance for the full liberation of Palestine. It did that even as it offered political solutions for the lack of a better word around partition. But it ideologically always maintained that it was playing the long game, and that actually it was not going to acquiesce to continued oppression. So it always maintained the possibility that the structure of containment would be disrupted. Now, what happened on October 7th is fundamentally that, a disruption of the containment paradigm, more broadly, the partition paradigm, which says that Israeli Jews can live in relative safety and security within their population centers, while Palestinians can be restricted in their enclaves and Bantustans, partitioned off from the Israeli political and social consciousness. And that Israeli can be safe while apartheid persists. Hamas disrupted that paradigm irreversibly. There's now no confidence among Israeli civilians that there can be any notion of security without addressing the Palestinian question. Now, so that's the paradigm that was disrupted. So now for the first question, are there indications that we're going back to efforts at containment? When the paradigm was disrupted, there are two options here that present themselves. One is engage with the Palestinian questions politically, engage with what the Palestinian political demands have been long before Hamas and have been articulated through Hamas today, or go back to the status quo, go back to the notion that we can have what we had before October 7th. Now, there are two schools of thought in that second point. One is the international community and this idea that now what the U.S., I'll focus on the U.S. Because they're obviously the biggest supporter of what Israel is doing now in Gaza, is beginning to talk about the day after. And the day after now looks like another form of Palestinian authority, another form of Western chosen illegitimate leaders placed on top of the Palestinian people to pacify the population under an unyielding regime of apartheid. So there is every effort to try to go back to that kind of model, to that kind of containment, which obviously Hamas can't offer anymore. And so the idea is, militarily eradicate Hamas and try to find these leaders that would continue to pacify Palestinians under apartheid. Both of these will fail. The military defeat of Hamas is impossible, and creating a situation where any Palestinian leader can come in and do what Abbas is doing in the PA, in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, is not possible. So that effort at containment is going to fail. Now, the second school of thought in this sort of effort to try to not engage with the Palestinian political demands is eradication, is to get rid of Palestinians, which is what began in 48, and as Amahl said, has been ongoing since. That's the structure of the Nakba. And what we're seeing today is a very violent rupture of what had been a low-fire Nakba that never ended. We're seeing a Nakba of our generation unfold before our eyes, because fundamentally there is an understanding within the Israeli political establishment that we can't deal with the Palestinian political demands and maintain Jewish supremacy. That actually, and this is where settler colonialism becomes the model, the only way to deal with Palestinians is erasure. If Palestinians do not acquiesce, Palestinians need to disappear. And this is what we're seeing, that spectacular violence that we're seeing happen in the Gaza Strip today. So yes, there are efforts to go back to containment. There are efforts to go back to some kind of measure that would pacify. They're based on the idea that Hamas could be removed from power and we can be done with. But the limitations of that is becoming clear. Unless there's international power to really engage with Palestinian political demands, the lesson Israel is taking out of this is that the genocide is the right answer. So I think I answered a couple of the questions. To answer the second two, Rami, your question, and then the question around settler colonialism. The question of what have we learned from the Nakba of 48 and where are we today? I think Amahl answered a lot of this beautifully in her intervention. I think we cannot compare the two. When the Nakba happened in 1948, Palestinians were not seen internationally as a people. Palestinians did not have political power. Today, Palestinians are seen as a people. There are protests in every country around the world. There's solidarity. Amahl called it collectivity. That is a form of power that is fundamental to us shaping the future now. Now, that's not to underplay what's happening. I often think in my dark moments of despair, I think about what's happening today as a generational issue, that this might take us back a generation to reconstitute our people and our movement and to recover from the genocide that's happening in Gaza. But there is political power. We have a movement that's global and that's intersectional in ways that we didn't in 1948. The way that the Palestinian question now is able to influence the Biden administration. We haven't seen the Biden administration take a position that's favorable to Palestinians yet. They've given Israel a carte blanche on every level, but the Biden administration is likely to lose the election over this. This is power for Palestinians that we didn't have before. And how that then constitutes into political power, I think is on Palestinians to decide and to push forward. We need to reform our institutions of liberation and to get rid of illegitimate and corrupt leaders who are no longer using the disruptive power that Palestinians do have to the benefit of the Palestinian people. And this is where I move on to the final question around what settler colonialism in other contexts has taught us. And I want to say three lessons that I've taken from other contexts. The first is the importance of having a strategy of resistance that is committed to asymmetry, that understands actually that we are not operating on the level that Israel is operating on. We are not as militarily equipped as Israel is, and we do not have the diplomatic power that Israel has. We have other sources of power, and we need to be able to use those effectively. And we need to understand that actually Israel loses if it doesn't achieve the full elimination of Palestinians. Palestinians, for us to remain to emerge victorious, we only need to challenge the central pillar of Zionist and Israeli settler colonialism, which is that there were no people here and we're the only people whose homeland this is. So we need to be able to embrace effectively a strategy of resistance that is grounded in asymmetry and that is committed to our peoplehood, because that's where our strength is. The second is the importance of having a solid ideology. And this is something that is fundamental, having an ideological grounding. And we have a long history of this. Palestinian intellectual thought and ideological thought goes back decades. And I think over the course of the past 3 decades of the Oslo project, a lot of this has been lost. The intellectual power of the PLO has been subsumed into the PA and has been lost. There's incredible intellectual and ideological production that's happening by Palestinians. We need to embrace that in a political project of liberation. Right now, it's often siloed in activist circles or in the academic world, and I think it's important to build a political project that's based on that. And the third, I think, is the idea, and this I'm thinking very specifically of South Africa, is the idea of understanding how to deal with the settler. And I think this is a question that Palestinians have really struggled with for understandable reasons. And I think in order to maintain an effective liberation project, we need to grapple with what decolonization means for us. And the lessons that the 60s and the 70s have taught us are really important, but they're also not entirely applicable. This is a specific context, and we're in the 21st century. We're in a world that thinks it's in a post-colonial reality. We're not in the throes of the anti-colonial struggles of the 70s and 80s. So what does decolonization look like today is a really important question that we need to be engaging with, not only intellectually, but politically. And I think that work is yet to be done. And I think looking at South Africa specifically to understand how the ANC defined its ideology as post-racial and as making room for a decolonial future that included the settler. I'm not saying that this is where Palestinians should be going, but I am saying that Palestinians should engage in the exercise of thinking about what decolonization means and what role the settler has, if any, in that exercise. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Tareq. That was amazing. And I agree with so much of what you say there. I guess I would just say a few things to add on. One about the difference between 48 and now. I think kind of it's hard to think of our kind of response to this moment, but rather to think about the institution building and the forms of resources that we've formed over the last decades and the accomplishments of the last decades that I hope will carry us through. I also have had those fears about this being generational shift that, will take a generation to manage or recover from, to the extent that that's even possible. And yet I do think that, going back to, international legal frameworks and progress that has happened, going back to the traditions of protest that continue and that, they faced setbacks due to a lot of reasons, right? The Palestinian Authority, Israeli arrests, other kinds of repression, but they continue and they can be re-engaged and re-engaged. And I do think that, protest is like a muscle that, and commemoration as two forms of being in public together as collectives, they are muscles that re-engage and reassert and allow for the next gathering to happen. And we need to kind of have faith in that possibility carrying through. We also have fabulous media we have some fabulous media outlets where there are spaces for some of this conversation to happen, and we need more of them. But actually, I was thinking about this. I absolutely agree that we need to have these, strengthen the ideological, the spaces we have for exchange as Palestinians and reinvigorate them, because in some ways it's something that has been lost. But I also think we can thank Tareq and Ashabaka and a few other key institutions that allow for that kind of thinking to happen, and how important it is when it happens in Arabic and in English and other languages. This is absolutely crucial for us. I think the question that you raise also about how to deal with the settler as something that was tackled in South Africa, needs to be thought about in the Palestinian context. And I really understand in kind of, in a somewhat visceral way, why that's so difficult to do, because of Israeli policies of closure and isolation and blockade that in particular affect, obviously, refugees outside of Palestine, people in Gaza, and also people in the West Bank. And I mean, again, as a person with on-the-ground experience in the West Bank, I understand what that closure and isolation has meant over that 23 year, you could say, of more intensified closure. And I know how much more severe that has been in Gaza. So I think we need to understand what that closure has done to it's just routed our political imaginations in ways that we have to, with great patience and persistence, begin to think about or continue to think about. And then also just to say that we need to be continuing to think about refugees, consistently. And that's part of rebuilding this Palestinian conversation and vision towards liberation that is absolutely integral.
Great, thank you so much. I think we have time for another round. So there's a question in the chat, and I invite anyone who wants to ask a question, either raise your hand or type your question in the chat. So Mona Harib is saying, thank you for your interventions. To what extent is the ongoing war reconfiguring social and labor demographics in Israel-Palestine, and how drastic are these changes? Will settlers, laborers be deterred from migrating to Israel? Are settlers leaving? Are Palestinians leaving if they have the option? So yeah, that's an important question. There's another question by Iyad, who is asking, what do you think should the Palestinian resistance strategy be and political demands be the day after the war stops? And what do you think should be the political objectives of the resistance? So yeah, I mean, this question links probably to what Tareq was and Amahl were talking about, I mean, the importance of having an ideology and thinking about what it means to decolonize in the 21st century and beyond the void academic term that has become a container for almost nothing. I mean, except advancing a career, but in terms of, I mean, political engagement on the ground, what does it mean? Okay, more questions here. Nasreen Salti is saying, fantastic interventions, both. Thank you. Right now, Hamas has a lot to capitalize on within the larger Palestinian community, and Hamas has generally been a pragmatic player. Do you see any possibility of more intra-Palestinian rapprochement among the various factions? Perhaps a new direction for the PLO, if it is able to open up to other players on the Palestinian scene? So we can turn back to you, Tareq and Amahl. I think there's a question on labor and Palestinian laborers and that travel and on Palestinian mobility more generally. There's a question on the day after and what the Palestinian resistance should prioritize as political objectives, and a question about Hamas and the possibility of redrawing the internal Palestinian political scene.
So, Amahl, do you want to start?
Only I can be brief because I also realized I didn't answer Rima's very great question about Arab Spring and Talat, and I just want to say that and that's only because I'm taking notes and then I lost my page because I was taking notes and appreciative of everything being said. But I think that, again, the Arab Spring is really part of that tradition of protest that is enlivening and inspiring and absolutely did seed Palestinian protest and sort of the possibility of being in the street in new ways. And I think that even when we see, even when we see that we don't immediately, of course, achieve our goals, those histories of struggle stay on and continue to make possible the next gathering. And I think they are regional. Those flows are absolutely regional. I also think that we need to think about, we need to be thinking against authoritarianism in the Palestinian context. And, again, speaking especially around the West Bank, we need to be, and in that way, the Arab Spring is especially important for us to remember as a legacy of protest. And Talat is a Palestinian movement, particularly, a feminist movement against violence against women. And it also happened in many different Palestinian locations, in Lebanon in 48, in the West Bank, in Gaza, I believe. And so I do think that a feminist approach and feminist voices are absolutely crucial here for re-enlivening a Palestinian politics that's liberatory and inclusive, and that thinks about many ways of doing politics from the ground up and in everyday ways, and that sustains the possibility for doing politics across those scales. Yeah, I really do want to underscore the importance of something like Talat. In terms of, it would be so interesting to see if Thai migrant laborers decide not to come to Israel and what kind of pressure that would put on Israel, which was able to import migrant laborers as a way of replacing Arab Palestinian laborers, from able to import labor from elsewhere in the world. Are Palestinians leaving? I mean, I would just say that the terrifying and sad thing, of course, is that Palestinians in some senses were leaving before all of this happened to a certain extent, right? Because, and for a variety of reasons, Palestinians being under so many different forms of pressure. And that's why we kind of need to build communities where health and education, and community care and safety are possible, as we struggle against Israeli occupation and apartheid, we still need to be doing those things internal to our own community to make life livable. Because I think there are people who are leaving Palestine because, they're losing safety. In 48, over the summer, the news was about, violent crime within the Palestinian community, which is not separate from Israeli racism and apartheid, but we also need to take community power to create those kinds of safety in our own communities as well. So just to say that, I think maybe that's what I would say. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Amahl. Then I'll take the Iyad's question and Nisreen's question. So on the issue of the political demands and the political objectives of the resistance, it's difficult to answer this question given how fluid the situation is. So I'll say a couple of points. The first is that I think Hamas's political objectives have already been met, in as far as it had imagined a certain kind of operation on October 7th that would disrupt the containment and really deal Israel quite a difficult blow. I don't think Hamas imagined the success, and they use this term without a value judgment from Hamas's perspective, the success of that operation, the fact that they would be able to go into Israel to the scale that they did and have the reach they did for the duration they did. I don't think that was necessarily something that Hamas had anticipated or prepared for. And I think that its military objective and political objective at the time was really the disruption and to create sufficient leverage for the movement to be able to begin to break out of its containment and change the balance of power on the ground. So in some ways, that has already been achieved. So that political objective has been achieved. Now, Hamas has 140 military hostages. As far as I'm concerned, and just looking at the way that the movement is negotiating now, they don't really care about the civilian hostages. They're willing to let those go with a 1-to-3 ratio, which is not where Palestinians are normally at. That indicates that what Hamas's objectives are from the hostages it has, the military hostages, is where its political objectives lie. And those negotiations, I believe, will focus on a couple of things. One, the release of the political prisoners that are in Israeli jails, the Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. And here, I think we'll go back to a ratio of 1 to the thousands. And it's unclear how far that will go. And the second is to force Israel to concede defeat in the sense that they will not be vanquished as a military power, and Israel not being able to meet that objective, which it had so explicitly put out, will already be a defeat. So in terms of political objectives, I think that at least in the short term, those are the two major ones that Hamas has. Force Israel into a concession or into a retreat or a defeat, and get out as many prisoners as possible out of the Israeli jails. Now, if Hamas doesn't return as a governing authority, I should say, that's also a victory for Hamas, because as I said, Hamas was ambivalent about governance. So this way it would be able to continue operating as a military power. And here I just want to have a footnote back to Rima's point, because I forgot to address that in the first one around Hamas abroad. Hamas still has power in Lebanon, and it has power in Qatar, or not power, representatives and a political presence. So even if it was expelled from the Gaza Strip, Hamas can reconstitute itself and is able to continue to develop that its role as a political project and a military force. So in that way, I think in this narrow way, I think this is how Hamas is thinking about its political objectives. But as I say, these things are in flux, and I think they will develop and unfold as we see how the negotiations go, and as we see whether or not Israel will resume fire now after this round of ceasefire. So then to Nisreen's point about the possibility of more intra-Palestinian rapprochement. So I think it's really important to note here how the PA and Fatah has dealt with this. I don't know if people here saw this. I was shocked. Maybe I shouldn't have been shocked. But there was a speech given by Nabil Abu Rudaina, who is a Fatah leader in the PA, who, once the hostage negotiations began, said, and the offer was on the table for the PA to come back into the Gaza Strip, said, you know, what's happening in Gaza and the negotiations that are happening between Hamas and Israel now are not of our concern. It's an internal issue between Hamas and Israel, and we would be ready to come back into governance on the Gaza Strip. So the level at which the Palestinian Authority has excised Hamas from the body politic is actually mirroring what the Israelis and the Americans are doing, which is to suggest that Hamas is external to Palestinians. It can be vanquished separately. And actually, the Palestinians are the good Palestinians in the PA who are committed to security coordination and pacification under Israeli rule. So that's not a good indication of rapprochement. But what I would say is that, and I think, Iyad, also your point generally about the demand for Palestinians, I think that now is the moment for Palestinians to really think about what reconstituting a representative leadership looks like. Because there's every effort to impose external leadership that is illegitimate, and Palestinians have to really grapple with what reforming the PLO or breaking out of the PLO, but into another form of representative leadership looks like. And Hamas has to be a part of that process, regardless of what anyone thinks about Hamas. And let me just say, Hamas at the moment is practicing a form of pluralistic governance in the Gaza Strip. The bodies that are engaging with the military resistance of October 7th and everything since then, the joint command room in the Gaza Strip is composed of 14 factions. It's not Hamas on its own that's doing what it's doing. And so there's already a vision and an operationalization of pluralistic Palestinian politics that needs to be carried over so that it doesn't only speak on behalf of Hamas and the resistance factions, but the Palestinians writ large. And for that to happen, obviously the onus is on Palestinians. So to push for a rapprochement, to push for a representative leadership that speaks on behalf of all Palestinians. But there is a duty here also on international actors who have done every effort to undermine reconciliation and unity among Palestinians. Back to Amahl's point about fragmentation. This has been a matter of policy of external players to undermine any unity among Palestinians on the political level. And they will oppose the entry of Hamas or any other faction into the PLO. And this is where Palestinians need to, and here I'm talking about Palestinian activists and civil society and going back to the idea of people power, where we need to be pushing for representative leadership. That is the only way we will accept any form of governance. It has to be grounded in representative democratic leadership.
Great. Thank you so much, Amahl and Tareq. We still have about 9 minutes for more discussion. If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand. Amahl and Tareq, I wanted to ask a question about, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what I've observed that the equation of Hamas with ISIS that was so prevalent at the beginning of the war in the Western media, but also in speeches by Israeli officials, has kind of disappeared in the past week or 10 days. And I wonder whether you have an explanation for why is this the case? Is it because of the shifting political reality on the ground and the development of the war, or is it something else? But the vilification of Hamas at the beginning as being this evil terrorist organization like ISIS seems to have fallen out of the general discourse. I wonder what you think.
I wonder if that may also be due to, again, the U.S. domestic pressure and around the world, protests that are sort of trying to impose a new way of thinking and sort of press that up through leadership and media. I think that maybe that has an impact. I also think that a news cycle that kind of looks at what's happened in the last 24 hours makes it a little bit harder to insist on that focus. Yeah, and I mean, I think also the whole process of negotiations being so visible and prominent is something that authorizes Hamas further in ways that yeah, can kind of destigmatize Hamas in that way of associating it like with ISIS or so forth, but is also something that we can, yeah, I think that's all I would say there.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I guess I'd say two minor points. The first is that Israel is really backtracking on its initial goals here, which was the eradication of Hamas. If Hamas is pure evil, and if Hamas is ISIS, then it has to be defeated, and it has to be vanquished, and that's not possible. And already Israel is backtracking. So already now it's that Hamas cannot govern, or that Hamas is expelled from Gaza. Already there's a kind of retreat that's happening in some ways for various reasons, including the fact that on the military battlefield, Israel is losing quite drastically, actually, and we can talk about that separately. But so I think there's a recognition that the more that conflation happens, the more it's difficult for Israel to deal with the reality of what Hamas is on the battlefield. And the second is because if Hamas is ISIS, then how are we negotiating? And we here are the Israelis. How are we negotiating with them for ceasefires and for hostage release? So there's a kind of there's already an internal contradiction that's happening here in terms of that initial framing. I think the Israelis have long understood, or the military establishment at least has long understood, that that conflation is not true, and that it's problematic. But Rima, I wouldn't overplay that. I think, when Netanyahu at least speaks, he still calls them Hamas ISIS. It's hyphenated in his rhetoric. So they're still sort of also trying to maintain that vilification.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Tareq. I'll have to look closer to what Netanyahu is saying. One last question before we wrap up. Malte Jorgensen is saying, thank you both. What is the role of the Palestinian civil society going to be in rebuilding a new political structure to lead them and continue the struggle for liberation? So, yeah, I think a question about civil society, I'm assuming not political groups, if I understand the question correctly.
I mean, I think this is the question in some ways, right? And it is a question that is made more difficult by these forms of geopolitical fragmentation that give different Palestinians different statuses across these spaces. And I think that, we need to, and I mean, I think when the answer to fragmentation is also not just unity. I do agree, absolutely, sort of rethinking about reforming the PLO or reviving another framework for all that represents all Palestinians is absolutely crucial, because without that, we can't answer a question like Iyad's about the objectives Palestinians should have right now, right? Although I think we stand by sort of longstanding principles about the right to return, the need for an end of military occupation, and the need for equality for all people living under Israeli sovereignty. I mean, I think those are three principles we can continue to stand by. But so we need a structure that brings all Palestinians together, that kind of unity, but we also need to take seriously local politics that are impacting people's lives on an everyday basis. And that happens differently, not only for 48 Palestinians than for those in Gaza, those in Lebanon, those in the West Bank, but also differently for those in Ramla or Lid than they do for, people in the northern villages. We need to take local politics seriously and work for kind of structures that bring all Palestinians together. And again, so I think, yeah, it's going to look different in different places. But our campuses are very important sites for organizing. We need to have conversations about modes of political participation that we find legitimate or not. I think, again, we need to find ways of being more and more inclusive of diversity of Palestinian voices, including poor people, including obviously refugees, women, thinking about all the different forms of Palestinian diversity that need to be involved as we revive Palestinian society. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that, and I think it's crucial to think about what unity and overcoming fragmentation looks like outside of these national political frameworks. I think that's fundamental. And the one thing I would add is that civil society is already doing a lot of this work. If we think about now. Where consensus is greatest among Palestinians, it's the BDS movement. It's the movement that can actually claim the widest degree of consensus from Palestinian organizations and Palestinian civil society and Palestinians generally. And in some ways, in the absence of a political framework, it has given some foundation for what Palestinian demands are. And I think that continues to be something that's fundamental going forward until that political leadership is able to emerge.
Thank you so much, Amahl and Tareq. This was a great discussion. I learned a lot, and I'm sure others here as well. I thank you, and I thank you for all the work you're both doing for advancing the Palestinian cause and the struggle for Palestinian liberation. I invite everyone to join us next week. Our panel on next Monday is going to be focused on labor and political economy with Tawfiq Haddad and Sai Englert. We will be sending around an invitation. I hope to see many of you there. Thank you so much, and have a nice rest of the day or evening, depending on where you are.
Thank you so much. Thank you for including me.
Thanks,
Thank you. Bye.